I'm going to be talking about covering war in times of propaganda. My heart was pounding with excitement and dread as our bus rolled inside the territory of Gaza. An achingly familiar landscape of destruction laid bare around us. The only difference was that the ruins felt too fresh and too raw, and the head swirled with imagined stories of the place and its people. And one of the images is behind you. Even now, when I think of that hot afternoon, I still get goosebumps. Having covered Kashmir, Chhattisgarh, riots in Assam, Uttar Pradesh, one would imagine you are prepared, but nothing prepares you for Gaza. It's not a conventional war, there is no front line. So how does one report war of that nature, where on one side you have Hamas, which is a democratically elected government, fighting a guerrilla-style war through its military wing, invisible on the ground. The Al-Qassam brigade of fighters have at best a couple of thousand rockets which are self-made. They do not cause much damage to Israel, which has the Iron Dome technology to intercept anything that comes inside their territory. Most journalists on ground in Gaza do not have access to Hamas operations or the fighters. On the other side, you have the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, one of the most powerful armies in the world, with the most sophisticated weaponry. Even their smallest rocket can cause heavy damage to the tiny strip 40 kilometers long that is Gaza. In Gaza, the primary source of information comes from both combatants, and that is when the basic rule of journalism gets broken, and that's when it hits you that some of these claims can never be cross-checked. So on our first day in field, we went to the Al-Shifa hospital, which is the largest hospital in Gaza. Expectedly, it was teeming with patients, grieving families, scores of journalists, photographers, and also official Hamas spokesperson. The incongruity was not lost because Hamas, which was the government in power, entire political wing was underground, and that was the only safe zone where Hamas could actually interact with the media, with the people, because it was a safe zone as the Israeli army would not attack a hospital. For the Israeli, of course, there was no such fear. They have a well-oiled propaganda machine in place. Their army has a battery of spokespersons, different ones for each region. When we walked into the press office first to get our ID cards, we were greeted with a namaste. The press officer in charge of Asia had an Indian connection. He had met his wife when he was traveling in India many years ago, and he offered us chai. The whiteboard in that conference room had seen a discussion on the right hashtag to promote online, to be able to counter the global outrage that the death of the children of Gaza who were being killed daily by Israeli bombings was causing. But social media was a leveler of sorts because you had both sides. The IDF would flood their Twitter feed with claims of Hamas targeting Israeli civilian areas, while Hamas was not so active on Twitter, but they would off and on post tweets about how Israel was only attacking civilians and how they had also managed to go in their front line. But the real Palestinian perspective came from local journalists and eyewitness accounts who would tweet in real time all that was happening on ground, where the bombings were taking place, where the casualties were happening, and that was surprisingly accurate, and one learned to rely on them for breaking news. So in this situation, how do you sift fact from propaganda? We will, of course, would have to wait for a window, a ceasefire, a lull in fighting to try and go towards the battle areas where one would hear tales of terrible violence. In one instance, we decided to take a gamble and actually try and go as far as possible during a brief stint in this lull in the ceasefire. After much deliberation, our translator agreed to take us to Rafah, which had been seeing heavy shelling from the Israeli side, who had broken the ceasefire, claiming that Hamas had captured one of their soldiers. Now, the road was absolutely empty. There was an eerie silence all around, and it was only punctuated by sounds of bombs which were going off in the vicinity. We were the only TV crew that managed to reach as far as the main hospital in Rafah, which is in the south of Gaza. And there what we found was that Israel had committed nothing short of a carnage. We found a family where 10 members of the same family had died that very day. The only survivors were 3 little children, one of them in the ICU, 2 of them at the main hospital who were being looked after by a relative, and who told us that the attack had happened at night when the entire family was asleep, and that there was no Hamas activity all around, considering that it was a purely residential area and any movement would be entirely visible. Some of these are graphic images. So it was clear then that Israel had continued to pound Gaza, even though the soldier they had claimed had been found dead some hours back, and they had also deliberately targeted civilian areas, not just Hamas posts, as they were claiming. In the hospital mortuary ward, there was not even space for any more bodies, and the press officer told us that any more bodies that come in would have to be accommodated on the floor. That day, Gaza did not even have space for its dead. And yet, for all the terrible asymmetry of war, some of Israel's claims about Hamas using civilian areas for the fight were not completely untrue, as we would find out much later in our stay. And that was the report that ultimately grabbed international headlines. On the second last day of our stay, we woke up to find an unusual sight. Right in front of our apartment building in a vacant spot of land was a bright blue tent under which there was some surreptitious activity going on, with a couple of men pulling in wires, going in and out. But of course we couldn't see what was underneath that tent, but it was clear after a while that there was some rocket that was being prepared to be launched. Now, of course, as is any journalist first instinct, you always record the act. So we filmed it, not knowing what it was, not knowing what we wanted to do with it. Next day was the last day in Gaza, and also the day the ceasefire was coming into place, early morning. So we woke up and we were packing to leave, and the ceasefire, there was heavy shelling from both the Israeli as well as the Palestinian side. And suddenly there was a rocket right in front of us that was launched from that same spot. So we hurriedly managed to grab some of it on our phone cameras. And then it was clear that what was happening under that blue tent was that a rocket was being prepared. This was, of course, something that we weren't again sure of how to use it, whether we should air it at all. There was much debate over it. But at the end of the day, we realized that as journalists, we have to bear witness to everything that we see. And in this situation, we happened to see this as well. This was not a story that we had gone looking for. We happened to be in a place where we saw what had happened. So we aired it. What, of course, happened later, which troubled us and deeply saddened us, was that it was used for propaganda by some vested interests, which was not the idea behind the report. The closest parallel to the complexity of the Gaza war would perhaps be Sri Lanka, which we traveled to in September 2011, which was 2 years after the civil war. The Channel 4 documentary, Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, had just been aired, and there was a lot of international pressure on the Sri Lankan government. So to show that things were normal, the government opened up and gave us rare access into the areas of the war which had not been opened up to the world media at all. Of course, some of these were army monitored tours. This is a photograph of former LTT cadre, which were at that time in a vocational training center run by the army. Now, of course, this was a bizarre charade laid out for us to show the successful rehabilitation of the former combatants. But actually, this picture shows you exactly the opposite. It shows you the tension and the strain that existed within the Tamil population and the government at that point of time, which was still recovering from the strains of war. And that's when I realized that sometimes even these monitor tours could throw up stories of pathos and show you actually those cracks that may be trying to be painted over. We were also taken to the last no-fire zone, where the civilians had been caught in a deadly crossfire between the LTTE and the army. All around were burnt vehicles, charred houses, and in that narrow strip of land which led to the beach, where another relic of the war was anchored, which was an LTTE ship. But what was strange was that we were not the only people on the beach. There were also Sinhalese tourists. The government claimed that these were families of the army men who came to visit, but clearly that was not the case as we found on the ground. And this open war tourism policy of the government highlighted what was the difference between what the Tamil population who had undergone the strains of war felt, as opposed to the government which was trying to make war tourism, make war memorials to highlight that they had won a war. And that would definitely not lead to a healthy reconciliation. And many of the Tamil people who were in the refugee camps actually admitted that life under LTT was not easy, but neither was it now. And until the government realized that, it would be very difficult to return. And that again shows us that the deeper, wider injustice in both Gaza and Sri Lanka was how life is under any sort of occupation, blockade. In Gaza, it's a strangely cruel mix because Israel controls pretty much everything that comes in, every sort of movement. And while the supermarkets would be flooded with all kinds of goods, you'd have imported shampoos to Turkish sweets. Pretty much everything is manufactured in Israel. But basic things like cement is under sanction. Israel, of course, alleges that cement can be used by Hamas to build tunnels with which it attacks Israel's civilian areas. But cement is also used for rebuilding houses, which get destroyed ever so often. We also met a lot of young people in Gaza, and one of my first questions to them would be, would you want to go study abroad, live in another country where there was peace? And one could imagine that their first answer would be yes, but actually everybody answered with an emphatic no, including the parents. And I found it a bit surreal to understand why they wouldn't want to live away from this constant shadow of war. They said that Gaza was home and that leaving that would not be an option, especially in times of turmoil. And it was only later that it struck me that leaving would mean having nothing to come back to. Now, Gaza, of course, is a war with many different names. For the Palestinians, it's resistance against an occupying force. For the Israelis, this war means reclaiming land that they claim historically belongs to them. For the world, it could be genocide, a conflict, a country trying to protect their self-interest, depending on which part of the world you belong to. But I'd like to end on an affirmative. I'll just show you some more images first of some of the young people we met there. I'd like to end on an affirmative. On our first day in Gaza, at the end of the long, hard day, we were feeding back footage to India, munching on some surprisingly good pizza we managed to score for dinner, when there was a heart-stopping blast, seemingly somewhere at hand. And seconds later, we could see smoke rising from near our window. And we weren't yet sure if it was an incoming strike or an outgoing rocket. And like everybody else, we just also rushed out of the apartment. Everyone was rushing down to the safety of the basement, and so did we. And foolishly, I was trying to lock the apartment door with the lock, and I was struggling. And in the middle of all the rush, there was a Palestinian woman coming down who belonged to the owner of the apartment building with her children, and she saw me struggling. And in the middle of all that tension, she smilingly, very calmly came to me and helped me. And it was then that I had one of the biggest learnings of my war experience, that war may scar you, but it doesn't always harden people. Thank you.